All right, welcome everybody to the second edition of our winter webinar series, and it's great to have Denise Ellsworth back, head of the Bee Lab. She's kind of a regular here. So, we'll talk about the bees in our Ohio backyard tonight. Denise, take it away.
Oh, great. Great. Thank you. Everything sound okay on your end?
Yes, it does. Everything looks
Super.
good too. Those pictures are
Super. And I should have
marvelous.
just double checked with you. Do you we go right 60 minutes and then questions or questions before 60?
Let's go to 60 minutes and then questions.
Okay. All right. Sounds great. Great. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us to learn about some of Ohio's bees. I know that some of you are bee aficionados, bee fans, and are very familiar with bees. Others maybe are new to bees or don't know a bee from a wasp. Welcome to everybody. It's learning bees is a challenging thing, and those of you who've been really digging in and learning bees or have worked with bees know we have so many different species. It can be a real difficult challenge. But tonight I'm going to try to break it down and talk in some general ways about bees, how we know if what you're looking at is a bee, what some common bee life histories are, and some of our most common bees. And then we'll just, if we have time, I'll share a few tips about how to have some practices and plants in your garden to bring even more bees to your landscape. So I'm with the OSU Department of Entomology, and I have a statewide appointment. And most of what I get to talk about is pollinators, which I really love. So in Ohio, we have mostly insects who are our pollinators, although we do have hummingbirds, of course, that are visiting flowers for food, for nectar. But the insects are really doing the majority of that animal-borne pollination. So the wind is a big player in pollination, carrying a lot of pollen from flower to flower. But in the living world, the insects really are playing a key role. And of those insects, of course, bees are the most important pollinators. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons why, what adaptations they have that makes them such good pollinators, and how we can look at bees and get a feel for who they might be. So I love this beautiful boy brown-belted bumblebee on this flower, and so by the time we're done, you should be able to sharpen your identification skills on bumblebees. They're one of my favorite groups of bees. I really love the bumbles. And one of the ways I can tell this is a boy, he doesn't have any pockets, no pollen back here on the hind leg. He has long antennae, which is hard to tell if you don't have a female to compare it to, but he's sniffing down into that flower, also sniffing for queen bumbles. He has really big eyes too, so that he can see her and hopefully mate with her and pass his genes along. So many of you are gathering here from other states. We're going to focus on Ohio. Somebody was from, I think, New Mexico. If you're from New Mexico, Arizona, California, you have a lot more bee species than we do here in Ohio, but we're still lucky. We have about 400 species of bee in the state, maybe up to 450 once there are a few bee surveys happening all the time, trying to compile all those species together, but we think it's somewhere around there, 400 to 450 species of bee. So that's really a lot of bee diversity. Some places in the southwestern U.S., 1,200 or so bee species. So a lot more bee diversity than we have. But a lot of different colors and shapes, sizes, and lifestyles. One of the ways we try to detail and quantify those species in Ohio is through iNaturalist, and I'm sure that a lot of you use iNaturalist, this great community science platform on your phone or on your computer. You basically take a picture, an observation of anything living or formerly living, send it up into the cloud, and then experts help to identify it for you. And you get a life list of things that you've seen. So, a really great tool, not only to sharpen your observation skills, but really those observations are used by scientists across the globe. And so when the rusty patch bumblebee up here on the left was first listed to the endangered species list in 2017, some bee scientists in Ohio, including Karen Goodell and Randy Mitchell, University of Akron for Randy and OSU Newark for Dr. Goodell, came together and said, we want to scout the state looking for the rusty patch bumblebee, and can we get community scientists out there involved as well? And so we put this Ohio Bee Atlas together on iNaturalist, and basically what happens is any observations, pictures that anyone takes in Ohio through iNaturalist automatically filter into this project. So I just want to show you these two slides. This is where we are today. So when I pulled this up today, we had 75, over 75,000 observations, pictures that people have submitted of bees in 218 species. And when I did this just for a group before the holidays, we had 211 species that had been observed and identified in Ohio. And so people were going through their phones and their photographs and submitting more observations, and more experts were going in there and identifying them. And so that number shot up. It's really neat to see how this has grown over the years. And you can see it takes a lot of people. More than almost 8,200 people have observed bees and submitted those images. And so I'm going to come back to iNaturalist, but I really encourage you, if you haven't used iNaturalist, it's a free platform. You can protect your location, so it's a secure site, and there are a lot of ways you can learn from iNaturalist. And so one of the things I like to do is filter the Ohio Bee Atlas, and wherever you are in the country, you can filter iNaturalist by your state or by your county and the kind of nature that you're hoping to observe or look to see what others have observed. And so in Ohio, I go to the Bee Atlas and I can click on species. And what it'll do is give me a list of, and here pictures of the most observed bees in iNaturalist in Ohio, all the way down to that, what were we at, 188 species of bee. So, that very seldomly observed bee. So it's a great way to learn bees if you're new to the world of bees. Why not start with the most common, right? If we were all going to veterinary school, we would learn the most common dog diseases and not the most obscure tropical diseases, right? We'd start with what was most common. And so it's a good place to start with bees as well. Now, these are just which bees have been more commonly observed. It doesn't mean that these are the most common bees in the state, or that the population is their most robust. But if you notice, these tend to be big bees, and they tend to be bumblebees because we originally were trying to get people to go out and look for bumblebees. These are bees that you're going to see that are charismatic, and people take pictures of them. And so we're going to meet some of these bees tonight, not all of them, but we're going to meet a few bumblebees. We're going to meet honeybees and sweat bees. We're going to talk about some different bees and how you can learn more about the bees that you're seeing. But I encourage you to go to iNaturalist and just play a little bit with, clicking on, if you go here to the website and you click on species, um, it'll pull up that list of species, and you can start with what's most common. So what is a bee? A bee is a cousin to a wasp that is a vegetarian. So this is our Western honeybee. Some of the ways we can identify a honeybee, she has a heart-shaped face. You can really see this heart shape here, kind of pointy down here, elbowed antennae. She has an exoskeleton that in this case is kind of an orange color, but the color can vary in our Western honeybees. We don't really see her big pollen pocket so clearly in this image, but they do have a corbicula, or a place where they store and transport pollen while they're out foraging. So some of the ways that we can tell a honeybee. She also has hairs all over each facet of her eye. So although we get the reflection here, each part of this eye is actually covered with hairs, which is fairly unusual in the bee world. So bees are vegetarians. They have to visit flowers for food, and that makes them different from their cousins, the wasps, which are carnivores. The stinging wasp, like this cicada killer wasp, who has stung to paralyze this dog-day cicada. They're not visiting flowers for food. Many times wasps will visit flowers for nectar, but they're not gathering pollen. For their protein source, they're using insects or spiders in the case of these stinging wasps. So think of bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets. Those stinging wasps are not using pollen for their protein source, but bees are. So, because they're vegetarians and they have to visit flowers for food, bees have a number of adaptations. And when we look at bees, we can see those adaptations. It helps us know if it's a bee or a wasp, but it can still be confusing because some bees look like wasps and some wasps look like bees. But in general, bees are fuzzy, right? They have lots of hairs all over their body. Not all bees have this many hairs, like this queen bumblebee. She's just full of hair. She has a fur coat that she carries around with her. And we can see how the pollen has really grabbed onto that hair, or the hair has grabbed onto the pollen on her body. You can see the orange pollen here on her head. So bees are fuzzy. Um, they have hairs that are actually branched. So here's an up close look at their branched or feathery plumose hairs. And these are pollen grains, right? And so those pollen grains are held onto that bee's body, and she can transport those from flower to flower. Bees also have an electrostatic charge. They have a static charge to their bodies. Bees are positively charged and flowers are negatively charged. So even before this bee lands on this flower, she can kind of feel through her hairs. She has nerve senses at the base of her hairs, and she can feel whether that flower has a strong negative charge or a weak negative charge. And that would tell her that another bee hasn't just been there, right? When you shock your friend or you scoot your feet across the carpet, you can shock your friend once, but you can't do it right away. You have to, second time, you have to go scoot your feet some more, gather more of that static electricity. And she can feel that static charge through her body, telling her that this may be a better flower to visit than one that doesn't have a strong static charge. So they're vegetarians. They're adapted to gather and transport pollen. They have feathery hairs that hold on to that pollen. They have a static charge to their bodies. And they have places on their bodies where these females gather and transport the pollen. So they visit the flowers, but they're not eating the pollen at the flowers. Typically, they're carrying that pollen back and either feeding it to the young or provisioning cells for the young. So this bumblebee, just like honeybees, they have the corbicula, the storage basket or pocket, we say, on the hind leg. And that's where they pack that pollen, kind of mixing it with nectar and then taking that back to the colony. On the top left, we have a leafcutter bee, and she has long hairs on her abdomen, and she gathers kind of a dusty pollen in those hairs. So mason bees and leaf cutting bees, other bees in that group, have long hairs on their belly for transporting pollen. And then another example down here, we have a mining bee, and we're going to see another mining bee in a bit. But they have hairy armpits and hairy legs. And so the females collect that pollen in those hairy armpits and then transport that to provision cells for the young. So she has a corbicula, she has a hairy abdomen, and she has hairy armpits. These are all females. So male bees don't do that work. They don't have those adaptations. They're not gathering pollen. Male bees may visit flowers for nectar, but they're not visiting and purposefully gathering pollen. They may get a little bit of pollen on their body, but they're not gathering and transporting pollen. It's not work that they do. So when you see a bee with lots of pollen on her body, especially if it's on her leg in a wad, right, or on her the underside of her belly in those hairs, or in her armpits or other places, that's a female bee. The males are not going to have those adaptations. Bees are also faithful to flowers, so they keep coming back to that flower over and over as long as the flower is offering resources. So flowers give guides. In this case, we see the nectar guides, these lines on the petals. They have coloration and they have sometimes it's UV markings that the bee can see that we can't see. But they're ways that the flower is advertising to the bee, come right here. Here's where the reward is. Because what the flower wants is a repeat visitor. The flower wants the bee to come and gather a little bit of pollen in a messy way. Don't gather all my pollen. Gather some on your body. And when you visit the next flower, just like me, some of that pollen's going to come off. So the bee is a courier carrying that pollen from flower to flower. Bees are messy shoppers, so they're gathering this pollen, but they can't get it all off. They don't provision the nest with all the pollen. Some of it's going to stay on their bodies. Bees have this, we call this a safe place on the back of their heads. It's like when you're trying to, my husband had his hat in his hood today and was trying to get his hat out. We can't always reach those spaces. And bees, when they're combing that pollen off of their bodies, they can't always reach these spaces. And so that's a nice insurance policy for the flower that some of the pollen is going to go to the next flower and hopefully will be left there, will pollinate that flower, and then fertilization can happen so that seeds and fruit can develop on the flower. Okay. So bees are messy shoppers. They learn how to work flowers and they're faithful. They keep coming back to those same flowers over and over as long as the flower is offering a reward. Bees are also central place foragers. That means they nest in a central place, like this little mason bee who emerged from this tunnel. They nest in a central place, and then the females forage out from that central place, going out, gathering pollen and nectar, bringing it back to that central place where they're nesting, where they're provisioning cells for the young, or where they're, if it's a bumblebee or a honeybee, these social bees, they're bringing that food back so that it can be fed to the developing larvae. Okay, so there's a central place where they nest and then they forage out from there and come back. This is really important for all of us who are gardeners because we can have all the flowers that we want in our backyard. They can be really appealing to bees, but if they have no place to nest, a really small bee, like a yellow-faced bee, somebody mentioned from Hawaii, smaller than a grain of rice, and that bee doesn't have a lot of energy to fly very far. So if you don't have a place for that bee to nest close by, they can't fly far enough to find the flowers in your yard. So flowers are important, yes, but those nesting places are important as well. And we'll see some examples of those. So there's central place foragers, and we don't have a lot of time to spend on this picture, but I just love this study that was done. These little worker bumblebees had a radar transponder glued onto their thoraxes, and then they were tracked as they left the hive. So the blue dot, an artificial bumblebee hive was brought into this field, and these individual bees were then tracked as they left on foraging visits. So the blue dot is that central place, the nest. And then the lines tell us where the bees went when they left the nest, right? So they forage out, always coming back to that central place with pollen or nectar. And those first trips they take, they're just trying to learn the environment. So they're kind of making that map of what's around. And then they find the food. And if we look up here, those yellow lines, this bee is leaving the central place. She finds the flower, gathers the pollen or nectar, and brings it right back. She makes a beeline for that plant. That's where it comes from. Beeline, the fastest trip from that nesting site to the flower and back. So they want to be quick, smart shoppers. Bees are also very seasonal, and this helps us with identification because if you're a bird watcher, you're going to see some migrating ducks, let's say, in March and April, and you're not going to see them all summer. They've moved on to nest. And there are bees that have these phenology cycles as well. We're going to see some bees in spring, some bees in summer, some bees in fall, some bees that kind of span the season. But if we can sort of associate or learn the time of year with the bees that we're watching, it can really help us to narrow down what bees might be out. So this queen bumblebee, this polyester bee, and this mason bee, these are all bees that we may see in spring. Mason bee and polyester bee only in spring, typically, depending on the species. Queen bumblebees we see in spring, and then we see newly emerged queens later in their cycle, usually late summer or fall. We can also think about bees as far as their social style. So some bees are purely social, like honeybees. They're completely social. They have a queen, workers, and drones. Bumblebees are also a social bee. There are queens. The drones are the males, and then there are worker bees, which are all females. If you weren't sure if a worker was male or female, you watched a little too much of the Bee Movie. Whenever I work with a group, it doesn't matter if they're kids or adults. There's a lot of confusion. They think, oh, the workers are males, but the kids, especially if they've seen the Bee Movie, they have all the wrong ideas that there's a king and all the workers are males. So we have to kind of unlearn before we teach the facts about bees. So all the workers are females, all the males are the drones. So we have social bees, and then actually most bees on Earth are solitary bees. That means they're just moms and dads. They mate, and then they have offspring. So they don't care for the young. And most of those solitary nesting bees are ground nesting. So most bees on Earth are solitary, just moms and dads, and they nest singly in the ground. Each female provisioning a little cell one at a time with pollen and nectar. We call that the bee bread. Laying an egg, that's enough food for the once the egg hatches out into the larva. That bee bread is enough food for that larva to grow and then eventually pupate and emerge. Depends on the species, but typically a year later as an adult bee. So in those solitary bees, whether they're ground nesting or tunnel nesting, like mason bees nesting in those tunnels or tubes, the females, the moms never meet their offspring. They do all that work up front, and then later the adults emerge, their offspring emerge. Okay, so we're not going to go too far into the different kinds of sociality, but I do want to give an example of each kind of social network or social grouping in bees. And so bumblebees, I could spend all night on bumblebees. I just love them. These big teddy bears of the bee world. They're a wonderful ambassador. A lot of you grew up petting bumblebees. When bees are on flowers, they're really there for the flowers. They're not too worried about you. And so chances are you have not been stung by a bee that you tried to pet on a flower, particularly a bumblebee. They have hair all over their body, very fuzzy. This is a queen bumble out in the spring. So right now, the bumblebees in your yard or in your neighborhood are tucked down underground as queens, maybe 6 or 10 inches underground in just a little hibernation chamber, a little hibernacula. So there are no workers that overwinter. There are no drones. There's only the newly mated queen from that emerged at the end of summer or fall this past year. So if we look briefly at this cycle, we see here's the hibernacula. So maybe down in your landscape bed or at the edge of your compost pile. Sometimes it's in an abandoned mouse nest. Oh no, sorry, not with the hibernacula. It could just be any space. They're actually really hard to know where these queens are overwintering because they're not the places where the bumblebees nest. They make this little chamber in another place besides the nest. So they're just spending the winter there. Coming up when spring arrives, usually depending on where you are in Ohio, it could be mid to late March, early April. We see those queens flying. And this individual queen has to start the whole colony. So the success of the colony depends on that one overwintering queen. There may be multiple overwintering queens from one colony, but the one individual queen who survives is starting her own nest, and she's the key to the success of that particular nest. Okay, so she has to go out, gather pollen and nectar. She actually makes a little honey cup and a little enough honey to enough carbohydrate to kind of keep her alive if it gets cold or rainy, which sometimes it does in Ohio in spring. She lays a batch of eggs and vibrates over them to keep them warm. They grow. She feeds them the pollen as they develop as larvae. Then they pupate and emerge as adults. Her daughters, her first batch of workers. And then she lays more eggs, and those daughters start to go out and bring back pollen and nectar. Eventually, the queen lays eggs that will become new virgin queens and new drones, her sons. They leave the nest and mate with others of the same species, and then only that queen who mated and who a newly emerged queen who mated has a chance to survive the winter. As I said, there may be multiple queens from that colony who emerge, mate, and overwinter, but each one has her own little hibernacula. Okay. And so we see queens in the spring, these newly emerged queens, about as big as your thumb. You see them out there in your garden. And then late in the season, we see the newly emerged queens. Depends on the species of bumblebee, but could be late summer into the fall. It just depends on that colony cycle. So here's a big queen bumblebee that emerged one October. There's my husband and there's me, and we're sitting out on a patio at Starbucks having coffee and tea. And we had a packet of sugar that had a little honey spilled on it. And who should come along but this queen bumblebee? See her tongue here out on that packet, lapping up that honey, trying to build her fat stores because she's got a long winter to get through. So the lesson, we do that with pumpkin pie and stuffing. She does that usually with not with honey that she finds at Starbucks, but with goldenrod and asters and other late blooming flowers. So really, a key to those how important those plants are in our gardens for those queens to overwinter. She mates. She's monogamous. She only mates once with one male. So here's the drone. She's much larger than that drone. And when do we see them? Well, in Ohio, think of the time that crocuses are blooming. This is a great reason to plant crocuses. One, two, three, four bumblebee queens. Here's a honeybee here on one little burst of color from crocuses. I think of looking for queen bumbles when Virginia bluebells are in bloom. Here's a brown-belted bumblebee, and James Hung took this picture, a really beautiful picture. This is in our future. It won't be too long before we see those Virginia bluebells and those beautiful queen bumbles. So just the up close look at that corbicula, so that space on the hind leg, we see it covered with this glob of pollen. It looks like a bundle of Play-Doh. This is what's underneath there, just this scooped out section on the hind leg with these long hairs. And the females are packing that pollen, they're mixing it with nectar from their honey stomachs into this glob and kind of weaving these hairs in and taking that pollen then back to the nest. And bubbles either nest on the ground or in the ground, depends on the species. But here's a colony that nested at the base of a bunch grass on one of our campuses. And so they don't need the winter protection, right? They don't need an insulated nest site, just a little bit protected from predators or from people walking through there. And when I mentioned mouse nests before, abandoned mouse nests are a common place for bumblebees to move into because they like that messy, um, all that fur and nest material from the mice. The bumbles like that as well. So that's just an example of a social bee. A queen, workers, and drones, they work together in a colony. The workers gather pollen and nectar. The queen primarily is laying eggs, and the drones are really there for reproduction. We typically don't see drone, we don't see, typically we don't see drones on flowers much. We never see honeybee drones on flowers. We see bumblebee drones. Sometimes they'll spend the night on a flower, or they may visit a flower to kind of scout for a queen, but they're never gathering pollen. Okay. So I mentioned how much bee diversity we have. This is just a sense of Steve Buchman stages this photo. He's an excellent photographer and bee researcher and author. And he put this little fairy bee perched on the head of a large carpenter bee, just to get a sense of how much variation is out there in the bee world. Both of them pollinators. Sometimes people see bees this small or these smaller than a grain of rice, and they think that can't possibly be a bee, but they are, and their food is pollen, so they're visiting flowers for food. So let's talk about solitary bees. So they don't have queens, workers, and drones. They have moms and dads. Here's our example with the hairy armpit bee, right? This Andrena mining bee. And so they emerge as adults and mate. Then the male's done. That's really his job. The female then kicks out the nesting material, the sand and soil from her underground tunnel. She gathers pollen and nectar to make this pollen ball, the bee bread. And then she lays an egg we see here on top of the bee bread. So that's all the food that this larva, once it hatches, needs to develop. It grows through different instars, different sizes of larvae, and then eventually pupates and emerges as an adult. So this mom never meets her offspring. She does all the work up front. So we're going to talk about one of my favorite kinds of solitary bees. This is a Calides polyester bee, Calides inequalis. Um, I have most all of the images are the photo credits on it, and I just want to recognize Heather Holm, who's an amazing bee biologist and photographer. She's also so active on iNaturalist and shares her photo library for educational use. And so just really, really appreciate Heather and others who offer their photographic skills for people like me who aren't as great with photography, but really appreciate an amazing picture of a bee. And so here, Heather's captured an image of this polyester bee on a maple. So this is a maple flower, early spring, right? Gives you a sense of when this bee is visiting. Here, these male anthers are offering pollen, and probably there's some nectar in here too. Maples typically have a little drink of nectar and a pollen reward. So this polyester bee is a solitary ground nesting bee. It's a solitary bee, but that doesn't mean we don't see groups of them nesting in aggregations. And so this is like a really popular neighborhood, right? We live in a neighborhood where there are lots of, I have my neighbors and you have your neighbors. We all like where we live, but we don't live in the same house. And so here, each one of these little tunnels, these little volcanoes, is the entrance to one of the tunnels, the entrance to one of the nesting tunnels underground. And so here's this female bee. She's already kicked out the sand and soil that settled down from last year. She mates, and so she flies really low to the ground here, maybe only 4 or 6 inches above ground. The males come in, they kind of roll around and they're mating. Um, and so it's a real show just for those few weeks when these Calides, these bees are active, and which is when I think of seeing red buds in bloom. So when your red buds are in bloom, think of looking for these polyester bees. Actually, the polyester bees do visit red buds. It's fairly common to see them on red buds. They're not a specialist, so they don't have to have red bud pollen for their young. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it is a phenological coincidence, so it's something that we see occurring. The bloom of redbud coincides with this bee emerging, and so it's a good reminder for you to go and look for polyester bees. So about the size of a honeybee, they're a little darker in coloration, a little more stripy than a honeybee would be, but about the size of a honeybee and active. This species is just spring active. So as an adult, only above ground for maybe 5 or 6 weeks. Then the females die, the males have already died, and next year, around the same time, when redbuds are in bloom, we can expect to see the new batch of polyester bees emerging. And why are they called polyester bees? Well, the female has a gland on her abdomen, and she can coat this little bubble or cell underground, this little nesting a nursery cell where the young are developing. She coats that with a substance that's like cellophane. If you've ever, in your town, in my town here, it's Haggis, you've gone to an old-fashioned candy store or nut store where they have those cellophane bags. That's what I think of as coating that little nursery cell underground. So she coats that nursery cell. She puts the bee bread in there, lays an egg, and then she seals off that little bubble so it's waterproof. So that even if it floods here, this is at the Toledo Botanical Garden, under the shade of an oak tree that hasn't leafed out yet, right? So this is early in the season. Even if it floods, that little baby bee is sort of protected underground in this little waterproof cellophane bubble. All right. So we talked about our social bees. We talked about our solitary ground nesting bees. Now let's consider our solitary tunnel nesting bees. So my example for us tonight is going to be the leaf cutting bee. There are lots of different kinds of leaf cutting bees. We're just going to talk in general about them. They have these big jaws, these strong mouth parts that help them chew off a disc of leaf and then roll it up between their legs and fly from wherever your cherry tree or Itea or hosta or redbud was. Usually these nice, soft, early spring leaves. They fly that leaf bit back into a tunnel, and they use those leaf pieces to make their little nursery chamber for their offspring. They have long hairs on their bellies, right? So they're related to mason bees, these Megachilidae, this group. And so here she is. She's got long hairs on her belly. She's doing the work. She's already worked this leaf, right? She's taken these discs off. It's like using a hole punch. And if you start at the edge, but you keep punching, you can get different shapes. But what she's doing is taking one disc at a time and then rolling it up and flying from, in this case, your rose plant, to a cavity or a tunnel. So it could be your bamboo wind chimes. It could be the drain holes in your metal patio furniture on your front porch. It could be a burrow that a beetle emerged from in your firewood. So she just needs a tunnel. She doesn't chew out or excavate a tunnel. She uses something that she finds, maybe a space between your bricks. And so for me, it was so here's what I found one day. I was out in my backyard. It was a really wet summer, and so I didn't use my water spigot at all that year. It was September, and I wanted to pick some flowers for a friend, so I got a mason jar and put it under that water spigot, turned it on, and what should come out into the mason jar but these little individual nursery cells from this leaf cutting bee, right? And if I didn't have the mason jar right there, I never would have seen these. They just would have fallen out onto the ground. And so we can see here the leaf pieces and the petal pieces. I know they were petals because I know they were oak leaf hydrangeas because I went around my garden to see where the hole punches were, right? Where had these adults been? I've never seen an adult leaf cutting bee carrying a piece across my garden. I hope to someday. But I can see evidence that she's been there because I see those punched out leaves. So 30 or 40 pieces per nursery chamber. She knits those together. Down in the middle is the bee bread and the egg. She finishes up that handiwork and then moves on to the next little nursery cell. Okay, and then she dies. She never meets her offspring. Those bees emerge as adults and then carry that cycle again. Now, maybe you've seen these little bald spots on your Dusty Miller or your maybe Cleary Sage or Lamb's Ear. This is a different kind of tunnel nesting bee. This is the wool carder bee. So she does look more like a wasp, right? She's pretty yellow and black in coloration, but she's more rounded than a wasp. Typically wasps are going to be a little longer and thinner. Also, she has a lot of hairs on her legs. Now, wasps may have hairs on their legs, but they're more like spines to grab and hold on to prey, right? They're not lots of fuzzy hairs to grab on to pollen, because that's not what wasps do. They grab prey and sting them or take them back and feed them to their young. And then we can see here all the hairs on her belly. So she's related to that leaf cutting bee and that mason bee. So instead of gathering a leaf disc, she cards off the wool. That's why she's called a wool carder bee. Cards off the wool from these plants, like Dusty Miller. So she made this bald spot. She rolls that up into a little ball and then carries that ball back to a cavity. So your bamboo wind chimes, or it can be a fuel line. I've had people tell me that they found these in a folded piece of burlap that they left outside last year. And that's a little tunnel, and the bees find that and turn that into a little nesting site. Here's a um, lamb's ear in my front yard, and you can see this bald spot here on the lamb's ear where that bee came and carded those hairs, rolled them up in a ball. Here she is on the underside of the leaf, and then she carries those hairs back as a little crib mattress for her offspring. They're not eating those hairs. They're eating the pollen and nectar that she's brought in the bee bread. And she lays her egg, and then that she seals it off with more hairs. So a nice little wad there for her offspring. Down here, what do you see here? A wool carder bee on what plant is that? Well, that's a milkweed pod, right? So I got a picture of her gathering the fluff from milkweed seeds and taking that back to wherever she was nesting. So a really cool find there by that bee. Another tunnel nesting bee that we're not so crazy about, perhaps, is this a bumblebee? I can't see your face right now, but if you're saying yes, this is a no, right? Bumblebees have rows of pile carpet on their abdomen. This bee has a little bit of hair back here, but we see the shine of the sun back here. And so this is a carpenter bee. They can be about the same size. They can be similar in appearance as they're flying, but a bumblebee is never going to have a bald abdomen like this. This is a carpenter bee. And so, where do they nest? Well, in our part of the world, they nest in wood, typically in softwood, construction woods, pine and spruce. Here's a deck where the railing has been excavated by, well, first of all, the carpenter bees moved in, but who came and did this damage? This isn't exactly carpenter bees. Somebody was trying to get at those carpenter bees. This is woodpeckers, right? So the carpenter bees are nesting in this wood along the grain in their galleries that are like fingers. They're gathering pollen and nectar, laying an egg. They're walling off their little cell with sawdust, doing that over and over in this wood. And then woodpeckers come along, they can smell and hear those bees, and that's an easy meal. So they start to peck away at that wood. Here's a male carpenter bee. That's the one that's coming and doing this to you, trying to challenge you and bully you. But boy bees can't sting. We didn't talk about that yet, but only female bees can sting. The sting is a modified egg layer or ovipositor, and only just like male chickens can't lay eggs, male bees can't lay eggs. They don't have the right characteristics, the right tools. Only the female can. And so you can catch a male bee, like a carpenter bee, and hold him and pet him. He can't sting you. So make sure, if you want to do that, that you find a boy that has yellow or white between the eyes. That's a boy carpenter bee. There are different species of carpenter bee. This is a small carpenter bee, genus Ceratina, much smaller. This is more like wild rice size. And they nest individually in pithy stems. So they don't damage wood, they don't damage our plants, but they nest in dead twigs or stems. And they may excavate the center of that pith or center. Here's a fennel stem. This is a raspberry cane. Here's a little carpenter bee. This is the bee bread and the egg that she had provisioned in the center of that raspberry cane. Doesn't hurt the raspberry. This is a dead cane that would be pruned out typically anyway, but the females can provision cells and rear their offspring there. Okay, we want to move on to so most bees in the world are solitary ground nesting bee, as is this bee, a solitary ground nesting bee. I want to spend a few minutes on specialist bees. So bees can be all on the spectrum between generalists, meaning what they feed on. They can feed on lots of different flowers, or they can be specialists. They only feed on one or a few different flowers, and that's for pollen. Okay, usually bees don't have a specific need for nectar from a certain plant, but pollen, they can be specialists. They can be pollen specialists. So, for example, honeybees and bumblebees, they're generalists. We see them on lots of different flowers in our gardens. They may have preferences, they may have favorite plants, but they can visit lots of different flowers for food. This bee here is a squash bee, and they're specialists on kind of cousins, squash, gourds, pumpkins, and cucumbers. So the female will only visit those plants to gather pollen to provision those underground cells for her offspring. Okay, so she is a solitary ground nesting bee, and she's a specialist. So that's the only pollen she will gather for her young. So if we excavated that little larva, we stole the pollen ball, we replaced it with goldenrod pollen back in the lab, and we made the conditions just right. We might be able to rear that bee. She might be able to emerge as an adult, she or he, an adult squash bee. But if it's a female squash bee, she is hardwired to go back as an adult to pumpkins, gourds, squash, and cucumbers. Okay, and we think the signal is really in the antenna. She's smelling that scent signal from those flowers. That's how she's finding the pumpkins and squash and gourds and cucumbers. So it's not that she can smell everything and she's sniffing out the pumpkin, it's that she has a very narrow range of scents that she can smell. So it's either pumpkin or not pumpkin, and she's finding her way to the pumpkins. So about a third of all bees are specialist bees. About 100 of our bees in Ohio are specialist bees, give or take, and they can be a single genus or they can be kind of cousins of plants that they will visit. Very few bees will go to only one species of flower, and you can imagine what could happen if that whole population of flower was extirpated from the area or became extinct. That bee would have no pollen to go to, if and it may not be able to evolve and switch to another plant. So typically there's a little bit of a range that specialists can go to. So here's another favorite, a lot of favorite bees. Here's another favorite bee. This is a Melissodes or a longhorn bee. She is a specialist on ironweed, Vernonia. And if we look at her pollen pants back here, tell me what color Vernonia pollen is. We'd never know this unless we saw her or really looked up close, but it's white, right? Look at her pollen pants. They're full of white pollen. So she's gathered that pollen, she takes it back to an underground tunnel, she provisions a little cell for her offspring, brings in enough pollen, mixes it with some nectar, lays an egg, and backfills that little cell, and then goes to do the same thing over maybe 10 or 12 times in her adult life of only a couple weeks. Probably takes her a whole day to provision one cell, and if she's lucky, she'll do that a dozen or so times before she dies. And then next year, those bees will emerge as adults when the Vernonia is in bloom, right? They're really perfectly timed, at least right now in today's climate. Although we're worried about the mismatch between bloom time and emergence for some species like these specialist bees with our climates changing. Here's another specialist bee. This is the boy. See, he's got lots of yellow on his face. This is an Andrena, a mining bee, and they are specialist on, in this case, asters. Another specialist bee, this is another polyester bee, so a different one than the one we saw earlier. That was a spring emerging polyester bee, and that one was a generalist. This is a specialist that emerges when goldenrod is in bloom. And so we're only going to see this kind of polyester bee in the fall when goldenrods are in bloom. So one of my favorite bees, and one of yours too, is the spring beauty miner. So this is another Andrena, another mining bee, a solitary ground nesting bee. And I guess I didn't put a picture of Spring Beauty in there. My bad. So Spring Beauty, that really delicate, early blooming wildflowers, only about 3 or 4 inches off the ground. Maybe you have some in your lawn or under some shade trees, all scattered through the woods. They're pretty tolerant in some lawn areas as well. I have some at the back, or I have some pin oaks growing. So anyway, they have kind of a white petal with pink or purple lines on them. And the pollen is this cotton candy pink. And so when we see this spring beauty miner, we see that her armpits and her legs are just filled with this spring beauty pollen, this cotton candy colored pollen. And she's not dead here. She's just been turned over so that they could photograph the underside of her. So that's the only pollen that she visits. So she's perfectly timed to emerge when spring beauties are in bloom. One thing I think is so interesting about this bee is, you'd think a bee that is a specialist on a flower would be the best pollinator of that flower, right? But Mother Nature is complicated, and there are a lot of different things that can happen with bees and flowers. So a number of years ago, we had a community science project where we had people go out, maybe some of you in this Zoom room, go out and observe flowers and watch for insect visitation. And so we worked really hard to say it's not a flyover, right? The bee has to land, or the insect has to land on the flower. And so landing is one thing, but feeding is different than landing. Feeding could be drinking nectar with their mouth. It could be gathering pollen with their legs onto their hairs. grooming that pollen into different places on their bodies. So they could fly over, they could land, they could feed. What are they feeding on? Nectar or pollen? Maybe both. Are they visiting another flower of the same kind, of the same species? And is some of that pollen being left on that other flower? So that's pollination. The pollen, usually from another flower of the same species, being transported by, in this case, a bee. But that doesn't mean that it's fertilization. So fertilization was when the pollen grows down those female flower parts and the sperm and the egg meet, and then the in the ovule and fertilization occurs so that seeds can develop and fruit can grow around those seeds. So there's a lot of different things can happen. So when people say, "Oh, this is the pollinator," that's not always the case. And a bee scientist, which I'm not, could really tease down and try to figure out, who is really the best pollinator of spring beauty or the most effective pollinator of spring beauty. Um, and it turns out researchers did look at the spring beauty miner and found that while she visits only spring beauty and she gathers lots of pollen, she's kind of greedy about that pollen. She wants it all for her babies. So she gathers as much pollen as she can. She knows exactly when that pollen is ripe. I think it's between 10 and 2. So she visits and hoards all that pollen, takes it underground, makes her little nursery cell for her young, comes back the next day and does the same thing. Other bees may come along to that flower, but she swiped most of the pollen. And so she actually isn't the best pollinator. She's not visiting a lot of other flowers. She's kind of hoarding that pollen. So it turns out other bees are better pollinators of spring beauty if they can get in there and get some of the pollen that she's left behind. So lots of really intricate things happening there. We just see a bee on a flower and we're like, oh, it's great. Look, it's a pollinator. But there are a lot of questions that bee scientists ask and strive to answer. So remember I showed you this picture before of some of the most common bees on our project, the Ohio Bee Atlas on iNaturalist. And this time I just want you to look at, you just kind of blur your eyes a little bit. All these are different species. These are all different species of bee, and these would actually scroll down all the way to, what do we say, 288, I forget now, species of bee that have been identified on iNaturalist for Ohio. So we could look at all of those different bees and all the different flowers that they've landed on. So notice just here how many colors and sizes and shapes of flower and my takeaway for you is that when you're looking at flowers for your garden and you want to bring in bee diversity, which I hope you do, you love watching bees and you want to bring them to your yard, floral diversity will bring in the bee diversity. So lots of different kinds of flowers, different shapes and sizes, blooming at different times of year. We already talked about seasonality, how important that is. So adding more flowers to your garden is definitely important. So diversity is important, but so is abundance. So lots of pollen and nectar, even if you only have dandelions. There's a few other weeds in here, but if you primarily have a serviceberry in bloom, when that's in bloom, that's really the key flower in your garden. That's still an abundance of flower of bloom, and so a lot of bees may come and visit that flower that's rich in pollen and nectar. Okay, so we may not have the diversity in our flowers then, but we can have abundance. I want to ask you to plant a few more native plants. So you don't have to be an all native gardener, but a few more native plants, because it's those native plants that those specialist bees are really relying on. They can smell those special plants. They can find their way. You put that ironweed in your garden, and chances are that specialist bee will find it. Especially if she can live nearby, she can sniff out your flower, come get that reward and maybe she'll nest if you've left a little bit of bare ground for her to move into. So a few more natives. You don't have to be all natives, but a few more natives would be great. Introduced plants are fine. They can be a really great pollen and nectar source, like this dandelion. But steer away from those invasive plants, honeysuckle, autumn olive. There's lots of others that are good for pollinators. So they offer pollen and nectar, but they're bad for the ecology. So, shy away from those. Learn to identify and eradicate, and shy away from those invasive plants. Seasonality is important. So, from our early maples all the way through to asters and goldenrods, try to span the season with bloom. Weeds actually can be great for pollinators. Here's a queen bumblebee on purple dead nettle. Um, Really amazing photographer there on iNaturalist. Thank you for putting your pictures out and saying I can use them, or any of us can use them for educational use. This queen bumblebee wakes up from her little hibernacula. She's been underground since goldenrod bloom last year with no extra food. She's metabolizing that fat in her fat bodies to keep her alive. So she needs to eat. And here she's got her tongue down, sucking out the nectar from this purple dead nettle, which is it's in the mint family. And mints tend to have a nice nectar reward for pollinators. So even if you don't have early season ephemeral wildflowers, but you have a little bit of purple dead nettle, that can be great for early season bees. Some nesting sites I mentioned are really important. If we want bees to find our flowers, they have to be able to nest nearby. And so that can be some bunch grasses. Maybe you have some firewood that you don't burn. You let break down a little bit. Beetles move in and out, and there are tunnels in here. Mason bees can move into there, leaf cutting bees. Raspberries are great for bees. I was just talking with a friend who has a raspberry farm, and she was talking about how many bumbles she gets on her raspberries when they're in bloom. So a really great nectar source. The bees are collecting pollen and nectar. This is not a showy flower. You wouldn't think for us it's not very, visually attractive, but the bees just love it. And then if you cut those canes, of course you're cutting those for fruit production, and then the stems are hollow. Little solitary bee, tunnel nesting bees can move in there. They don't get back and damage the plant. They're just living in that dead center, and they can come out to keep pollinating flowers in your garden. So those nesting sites are pretty important. If you have bare soil, can you protect it? If you know you have places that solitary bees are nesting, can you make sure nobody tills there? Nobody spreads an herbicide or an insecticide, or a neighbor moves in and that's a spot where polyester bees are nesting. Help them learn about those bees. These are called tickle bees because they don't sting. They're very docile, and they're actually going to shy away from you into that tunnel to protect themselves. Be careful what you use as far as products in the garden. Pesticides of all sorts can be damaging to bees, so take care of what you're using. Look to your extension office for recommendations to manage pests using integrated pest management and chemicals that are least damaging to bees. Many community gardens don't allow pesticide use, and these gardeners find other ways to manage or tolerate their pests. We have a project called Plant by Numbers where you can get access to some garden guides in different themes. So we actually have a theme on specialist bees. And if you click on the garden guide for specialist bees, you get this 6 by 10 design idea, and then a plant list, first choice and second choice plants that will all attract specialist bees. And you don't have to plant the whole design, but just gives you ideas for a few plants to add to your garden. If you plant all 8 of these plants, that's food for over 100 specialist bees. I don't know if all 100 are coming to your garden, but boy, wouldn't it be fun to find out? Just take some pictures and put those on iNaturalist. Other themes we have bumblebees. Those are all listed on our website. Butterflies and moths. We have hummers and singers, hummingbirds and songbirds, good garden bugs. So these are all native perennial garden designs that are suitable, that will attract these different pollinators and good garden bugs. We have a new one coming out, I'm hoping by the end of February, Shady Spaces for Pollinators. So even if you don't have a lot of sun here are some plants that you can add to the garden. I know you did those soft landings, and these are great plants that are a little bit shade tolerant, but are really great for pollinators. So some ideas there. And again, that website, let me go back here, oops, it's a Go website. So you need the whole HTTP. Sorry, I left that out. go.osu.edu/plant by numbers. Maybe somebody can pop that in the chat box for us. And okay, places to go for more information. So the Xerces Society and Pollinator Partnership are two really stellar nonprofits that focus on insects and pollinators. They both have plant lists and posters and freebies online, plant guides and webinars, so many great resources. So you'll want to check out both of those websites. I'm at blab.osu.edu, and I try to gather resources and links and things that I'm looking for, bumblebee guides, other PDFs and other great information there at blab.osu.edu. Like you, during the pandemic, we did lots of webinars, and all of our webinars are indexed there, archived, sorry, on the B Lab website. So you wake up at 2:30 in the morning and you can't sleep, you just click on a pollinator webinar. We have lots of them there for you. Let's see. So I got a question about the poster. I always do. And so the poster behind me is Backyard Bees of North America. That's from Joe Wilson and Olivia Carroll, author of The Bees in Your Backyard, this wonderful resource. If you're looking for um, a go-to guide to help you learn about identifying native bees, this is it. It's tough, okay? It's not like you're gonna look through this and over the weekend you're gonna be a bee expert. It's something that the pictures are amazing. The detailed information is so helpful. And it really is something that is helpful as you dig in. You add a few bees this year. Next year you add another bees to your repertoire, and pretty soon you're gonna be able to learn more of the bees in your backyard. And this is really a great guide to get you started. Now, Olivia is coming to Ohio. We've had her come several times over the last several years. Took kind of a break for the pandemic. We were off for a few years, but she is coming this year, and she's going to be at a couple different locations. She's going to do a workshop down at the Arc of Appalachia. She's going to be at Stratford Ecological Center, and she's going to be at Mount Union's Broomba Nature Center for workshops. And so I put a quick link down here. Somebody can type that into the chat box, perhaps. If you click there, I'm just have a simple form that you can fill out with your email, and you'll get the details when we know the dates and locations, and registration is ready for Olivia's return to Ohio. She's an amazing bee biologist. She's so fun in the field and a really great educator. She actually teaches middle school, and I just want to go back to middle school and learn from Olivia. I've just benefited so much from her knowledge, and she's one of those people who's incredibly generous to share what she knows. So you can add your email. I'm happy to send you information when we have it. And this is my email, ellsworth.2@osu.edu. Again, the B Lab website. And I'm happy to take questions if we have time for that.
I think we have a little bit of time, and if you have questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box. So we'll go ahead and get started. Do we know why honeybees have hair on their eyes?
Well, we think it's because they're such good navigators, and that can just help them. They have to get from all these different flowers back to the hive. They're using polarized light, they're using all these different cues, and we think also the wind direction, and they can really sense that so easily with all those hairs on their eyes.
Nice. How does the bee release the pollen collected once back at the nest? Is it vibration?
So actually her sisters, the other workers, are there in the colony just waiting for her, and they're eagerly taking that pollen off of her. Now, if you're a beekeeper, you know that you can have a pollen trap on your hive, and that is just a little screen, and the bee is too wide. Her chaps are too wide to get through that screen, and so the pollen falls off. And so you can see it's not really, it's not cemented on there, and so the workers if there's not a pollen trap, the workers can just take off that pollen and then she comes and waggles and off she goes to the next flower.
Nice. Someone uses tree leaves as mulch in the flower gardens. Are the ground nesting bees able to get through the leaves to get to the ground?
So, if you know that soil nesting bees are nesting, it's good to not use a wood mulch. But the leaves are going to break down, and so unless you're using, really super thick layer, um, that might dissuade bees from nesting there. But if bees are already nesting there and you put a layer of leaves, they're going to be able to dig up through that. So, it's really our wood mulch that can keep the bees from nesting there. There's some studies that have shown, I don't really like this look, and I'm sorry if this is how you garden, but I don't like the gravel pit look in my garden. And so, but there have been some studies that have shown that using, the pebbles or the different kinds of stone as mulch, bees can still find their way in, and that can actually, be complementary to bees nesting there. So it's really, plastic is totally off the table. Don't cover with landscape fabric, or any kind of plastic, but some, some leaf mulch on there should be fine.
Okay. What happens to specialist bees if there's no plants of their favored genus in their foraging range?
So they're going to nest where they've already found the flowers.
Mhm.
So if you have let's say you have an ironweed in your garden and you've just planted an ironweed in your garden and you see this specialist bee coming in. Well, she's nesting near enough that she can find that flower, right? If she couldn't nest nearby, she couldn't find your flower. And so, um, right. There was a concern or a question that came up several years ago. We were planting some native hibiscus in people's gardens and saying, wouldn't it be cool if you had the turret bee move in, which is a specialist bee on hibiscus. Uh, well, if there are no hibiscus bees nearby, they're not going to be able to find that flower, but it doesn't hurt anything.
Mhm.
You may get, maybe at the edge of its range, you find one bee who finds it and finds a suitable place to nest. So it doesn't hurt to put those plants in and hope that the specialist bees will find them.
Got it. Are there more goldenrod specialists than other specialists because goldenrod is just so dominant in the fall environment?
So there are a lot of bees that are specialists on goldenrod, and on our website we have actually so on the I don't know if I can do this really fast, but let me see if I can. On the Plant by Numbers website, oh, sorry, I can't talk and do at the same time. So here's the Plant by Numbers website. If everything crashes, I'll just be really bummed. No, it's going really super slow. So on the Plant by Numbers website, if you click on specialist bees, there's a link to Sam Droege and Jared Fowler have done a lot of work on specialist bees. And so they list which bees go to which plants attract which bees. And goldenrod is right up there. Sunflowers, goldenrods, asters, blueberries, some of our best native plants for, yeah, it's not pulling up, sorry, for specialist bees. And so, yeah, those native plants that they have, goldenrod is just a win, and it can be a cultivated goldenrod. So fireworks is a cultivar of the gray goldenrod, and it's beautiful in the garden. It doesn't go crazy. It doesn't spread underground. It doesn't. It's not a bully in the garden. It's beautiful. Lots of pollinators come to visit it, but it's also good for specialist bees. So it's really a win. And I think I want to say there's like 3 or 4 dozen different specialist bees that come to goldenrod.
Is there a list of Ohio native plants that are preferred by particular species of bees? There are many lists of Ohio native plants that are preferred for particular species of bees, right? And Bee Lab would be one of the
Yeah.
first
So
places to go
it
to.
depends what you mean. It depends what you mean because like we know plants that are good for bees, but we don't always know which bees are coming to those flowers, right? So it depends what your question is. Do you want to know which flowers are good for bees? We have a lot of lists that say these are some great plants for bees. But
I
if you
think
want to know
that's the
which
way it
bees
is.
visit this flower, that's a different question. It's a little harder to answer because we don't always know all those species. So that's where something like the list of specialist bee plants is helpful because you know which plants those bees have to have. You know, they have to visit those plants. So yeah, we have yeah, on our Bee Lab website, we have lots of great plant lists that many places have compiled. We have you know, gathered all their websites together. So you know, Penn State has lists, Michigan has lists. There are some really, you know, Xerces has some wonderful um oh, here it finally came. Let's see if I can share this. I'll just try to do this. Okay, so here I am. Under so this is my Plant by Numbers website with all the guides that and Shady Spaces is coming. And if you click on more information, so for each of the themes, we have more. So here's the host plants for pollen specialist bees that I mentioned, Jared Fowler and Sam Droege. There's some really great references for specialist bees. So I try to, for each of these themes, I try to give you more information.
Excellent. Is there any male bees that sting?
You know, it's not fair to ask me a always and never question with Mother Nature because she doesn't like that.
True.
But I would say that I have never heard of a male bee that stings. Now, bees can pinch or they can use their jaws to pinch or bite. In fact, there's a stingless bee that makes honey in tropical areas, and so it's a valuable bee for honey production. But it doesn't mean it's not painful. And I've never experienced what it does, but it can pinch where tear ducts are. So it's attracted to your eyes,
Huh.
and it pinches it bites around your eyes, and you have lots of these stingless bees. That are harassing you, so you'll get away from their nest. So I don't know of any male bees that sting. That doesn't mean that there isn't one somewhere. So there are actually hermaphrodite bees, so they have both sexual organs. So it depends what you mean by that. So see,
Hmm.
Mother Nature doesn't like the
Yeah.
all or nothing questions.
And it's best not to tick anybody off, right? All right, so the next question is, will iNaturalist distinguish bees from wasps?
Yeah, so if you so this is a cool thing about iNaturalist. Let's see, did we go there to the Bee Atlas together? It did my screen switch with you?
Yes.
Okay. And so when you upload an observation, an image to iNaturalist, it'll ask you either on your phone or on your computer, what is it? You don't have to type anything. You could type SOMETHING. I don't know what it is. It's something. It goes up into the clouds, and experts who will start to tease things apart. So they'll be like, oh, that's a wasp that goes over here, or that's a bee that goes over here. And then which kind of bee and which kind of group and which genus. And then eventually, hopefully, they'll be able to identify your bee. So you don't have to know a lot about what or anything about what you're taking a picture of. These experts are going to help illuminate that for you. And then, you know, on your phone, you've got a life list of what you've seen, and it's been identified in most cases in the bee world, these are like some of the experts in the world who are coming in to identify these bee images. So a really great way to increase your knowledge about bees. So yeah, it'll tell you whether it's a bee or a wasp. I didn't really get into that tonight, but and it's a really great place to start. Is it a bee or a wasp?
I usually say that iNaturalist is the only AI I want to improve.
Yeah, right. It is a really incredible resource. You know, when I went to school at OSU in the late 80s and 90s, we were, you know, I have all the field guides downstairs. We had to learn all these genera, genuses, and you know, I studied plant families and now I think, man, is a lot of that really obsolete because there's so much that AI can do, but y your brain plays a role too.
Hmm.
So.
All right, so what would you say is the approximate total number of native bee species in Ohio?
So I asked Karen Goodell and Melissa Spring this question. I had a program last fall, and I said, "What's our running number?" I'm generally saying about 450, and they said because they're actively surveying the state, doing bold traps, doing netting, looking at historic collections to quantify how many bees species do we have in the state. And it's ticking up closer to 450. And so they were both like that seems like a good guesstimate. So I think most of my slides now say over 400 species. Now in Michigan, they've done a survey across the state. They feel pretty confident about their number. They've been at this longer than we have, and I think they're at 465 as far as species go, and maybe even they've added a few onto that since I've looked. So
Got a few more questions. If a bee tunnel gets plugged with dirt, are the offspring able to emerge?
right, so if we imagine this hole and this tunnel underground, and then at the end there's a little cell. Several little cells, let's say, but at one there's a cell, and in one cell the adult bee emerges, and then she has to crawl her way, find her way through that tunnel until she reaches the earth or the sky, right? So she sees the sky. She gets to the opening. So she is cleaning out that tunnel. She's taking out that soil that has filled in over the prior year, right? So that's what that little volcano is. It's all the sand and soil that she's cleaned out of there. So then it's going to rain and settling is going to happen and some of that soil is going to work back in. And then the next batch of bees, they're going to clean that out again. So this is valuable real estate. These species are reusing the tunnel that their mothers made or that their grandmothers made. And so they're kind of cleaning that out and reusing that, maybe expanding it, but reusing that tunnel.
Well, that kind of piggybacks into another question of do bumblebees make their nest in the same place every year?
So bumblebees are just so incredible. They um, they are they're an annual species, so they nest. That queen builds the colony, and they only nest there 1 year, and then the new queens emerge, and they don't reuse that nest. They find a new space. Each individual queen who survives and is mated finds a new space to start a new nest, and so. Um, Right. So that's what one of the reasons we don't see a huge number in a bumblebee colony because they have an annual colony. They have to start over from one queen every year. And that number has to build up and then a new queen, maybe multiple new queens emerge from one nest, but each individual queen has to overwinter and then she has to find a new place to nest.
Okay. What are your thoughts on mason bee houses?
So here I finally got to so here's a queen bumble who was finding a nest site. Often they look for a dark space in between so here's the debris, right? And this is a strawberry patch. So she's finding a dark space, hoping to find a little cavity underground to develop her nest. Mason bee houses, if Mason bee houses are great if you're especially if you have an orchard or you have a lot of fruit trees. I mean, Mason bees are a great agricultural pollinator of cherries, apples, pears, peaches. They're an early season bee and they're extremely efficient. They can pollinate when it's cloudy, when there's light rain, when it's cool. Whereas honeybees need it to be sunny and they need it to be warm. They won't go out if it's a little bit of mist. And so mason bees can be better pollinators than honeybees for these early season fruit crops. So mason bee boxes are great but you got to manage them. You can't just and this is not a technical, this is a tunnel nesting box. This isn't what an orchard would use, but you get the idea, right? A nest with all these tubes in it. Um, just like martins, purple martin boxes or bluebird boxes, you don't just put it out there and leave it. It takes a lot of maintenance. You have to come back. These mason bee managers, right, are taking those tunnels out. they're lining each one with paper. You can buy these paper liners that helps to prevent disease buildup in those individual tunnels. They're actually taking all those bees out in early fall and sorting through them, looking for dead ones, looking for diseased ones, and then they're probably doing a bleach rinse, and then they're using a special humidity chamber to overwinter those mason bees so that, if you're doing this for a business because you want good pollination, it's not just you put the box out and wait for them to do their thing. Um, you have to manage them, and the timing is part of it. And so those bees are ready. They're refrigerated, and then they're ready when your crop is in bloom. So it's
A lot of work.
yeah. I'm not a big fan. Now, some of my colleagues, in fact, our department chair, Jamie Strange, he talks about um, bee hotels, and they can be good to help people learn what solitary bees are. Um, I'm not a big fan of them because um, usually it's non-native bees that move in to bee
Mm.
hotels, and non-native bees aren't threatened, and so we're not really helping native bees. And I think it's more important to plant flowers. Right? That's really where it helps if you plant flowers. Bees can find places to nest. Now, having a hotel, bee condo or a hotel at a nature center or a school or your master gardener demonstration garden or a community garden where people can come and see and like, wow, what is that? And what, you mean they're not stinging you? And what is that green wasp doing? And, that can be great for people to learn. It's not saving the bees, but it can be a nice educational tool.
But planting flowers is a lot less work. All right, last question. What's a
Yeah.
good alternative to wood mulch?
I mean, I love leaf mold. I don't use any wood mulch. I also use sweet peat as a top dressing. I mean, it gets to a place of what you like as a gardener and what your goals are as far as mulch goes. But I think some nice community leaf mold can be wonderful and a nice layer to prevent weed seedlings from growing. It kind of depends what you have available and what your budget is. But a wood mulch will inhibit solitary bees from nesting in the ground. But you may have really compact soil and a place where those solitary bees aren't nesting anywhere anyway. So um, there's always trade-offs in the garden.
Got it. All right, Denise. Well, thank you so much. Great information, beautiful pictures. And I will let you go. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank
Yep.
you. Stay warm, right?
Stay warm. Yes. All right, and bye.